In this video, I'm going to begin to work through the review questions for test number 3. In this video, I'd like to focus on specifically lesson 10, which talks about the transformations of functions. And initially on this review, they have the different transformations broken down into categories for you so that hopefully you can learn and understand the patterns. So when we think about a shift occurs if a constant is added or subtracted. And you can either have a vertical shift or a horizontal shift. And again, it kind of depends upon the location of where you add or subtract the number. So for example, in question number 1 here, it says, suppose that g of x equals f of x plus 3. How can the graph of y equals g of x be obtained? So they're basically asking us what we have to do to f of x to get g of x. Well, in this case, what you have to think about is where are you adding that particular number? Notice that the plus 3 is outside the parentheses, and when the value is outside the parentheses, that lets me know that it's going to be a vertical shift, and it's either going to go up or down. So this would be a vertical shift, and it's vertical in the sense that it's going to go up 3 units. It goes up because it's positive. Kind of follow the logic. Up would be positive, down would be negative. But if you look at the second question says, what do you get if you do f of x plus 3, and the plus 3 is inside the parentheses with the x. So it's with the x, so that tells me that it's going to be a horizontal shift, and it's actually opposite of what you think. So if it's plus 3, you're actually going to the left 3 units. It's backwards to what you would think when you think about the horizontal, because basically we would take the expression x plus 3, set it to 0, and solve, and we get x equals negative 3. And so that kind of makes more sense that I'm going to go left instead of right. The third one, we have f of x equals, g of x equals f of x minus 3. Again, the minus 3 is outside the parentheses, so that lets me know it's a vertical shift. And because it's a minus, we're going to go down 3 units. Then the last one, again, we have f of x minus 3. And again, in this case, it's inside the parentheses with the x, which lets me know it's horizontal. Remember, if it's with the x, you're on the horizontal axis. And again, it's opposite of what you think. It's minus 3, so we're going to go to the right 3 units. Again, if you take the expression in the parentheses, x minus 3, and solve for x, again, it becomes more obvious that it is a positive 3. A second transformation is the idea of a reflection, and you could either reflect it about the x, so that you're flipping it over the x-axis, or you can flip it or reflect it with respect to the y. So you can flip it across the y-axis. And again, it depends upon the location of the value. It's really determined by the sign, whether it's a positive or a negative. In question 5, it says g of x equals the negative, and notice the negative is outside or in front of the f of x. That lets me know that we're going to reflect on the x-axis. Okay, so if it's out front, in front of the f of x, it's reflection on the x-axis if it's negative. For question 6, where you have it paired with the x on the inside, that's going to be a reflection on the y-axis. Okay, so again, it's all about the location of and the value of the number. So you got to kind of learn the different locations that numbers can be. Also, that can be, instead of being just a 1 or being +1 or -1, you can have a numeric value either in front of the f of x or with the x inside the parentheses. And that determines whether you have a stretch or a compression. A compression would be sort of like, think about a shrink. And in some ways it makes sense, but you have to, again, pay attention to where it is located. For number 7, when you have that value in front of the f of x, again, that affects the y value, and it's going to be a vertical. And in this case, it's a stretch. With vertical, it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If the number is bigger than 1, it's going to be a stretch because it gets bigger or taller. If it is less than 1, it's going to be a vertical compression because the graph itself would be compressed, sort of like think about like a trash compactor, and it would be compressed. In the number 8, notice that the 2 is inside with the x. So again, that affects the x, and that is a horizontal. It's really a compression. Again, it seems backwards. And the compression would actually be 1 over b, but it's a horizontal. It causes a compression of your graph. Number 9 has the 0.5 or 1/2 in front of the f of x, so that's going to be a vertical compression. Again, it's a compression because it's less than a half. If it's the vertical, kind of makes sense because if it's less than 1, it's a compression. If it's greater than 1, it's a stretch. The horizontal is usually backwards to what you would think it would be. So for number 10, the 0.5 or the 1/2 is inside the parentheses with the x, which is going to make it horizontal because it's affecting the x, and it's going to be a horizontal stretch. Okay, now you got to know the pieces individually, but also on the test, you have to be able to kind of look at a function and put the pieces together so that you can have multiple transformations at the same time. And so I've added a couple of examples here so we can refer to them, or you can refer to them and look. And these are questions similar to what you would see on your lesson 10 quiz as well as on test 3. So if I'm looking at this first one, I have f of x plus 3 plus 2. Well, the first thing I notice is this plus 2 outside the parentheses. So it's kind of tagged or an afterthought. And that represents the shift. And this would be a vertical shift. And we actually would go up 2 units because it's a 2 and it's positive. We go up. The second thing that I notice is the plus 3, which is inside with the x, so it's affecting the x. So that's going to be a horizontal shift because it's with the x, and it's opposite of what we think, so it's going to go left 3. So this particular function would be shifted up 2 and left 3. Letter B, here we have f of 1/3 x, okay? The 1/3 is inside the parentheses with the x, which lets me know it's going to be a horizontal, either stretch or compression. Since it's 1/3, which is less than 1, it's actually a stretch, because remember, it's backwards to what we think. Letter C, here we have 2 times f of x minus 3. And it really doesn't matter how you describe it, but initially you have minus 3, okay, which is kind of there tagged at the end. It's outside the parentheses. So that lets me know I'm going to have a vertical shift. And because it's minus 3, we're going to go down 3 units. The 2 that's in front of the f of x is going to affect the y value, and that's going to cause a vertical stretch, and it's a stretch, again, because the value is greater than 1. Now, if you contrast that with letter D, the 2, you have f of 2x minus 3, and the 2 and the 3 are inside the parentheses. So this affects it totally differently. The minus 3 inside the parentheses tells me that it's going to be a horizontal shift. And again, it's opposite of what we think, so we're actually going to go right 3 units. And then the 2 on the x tells me there's going to be a horizontal compression. Okay, and it's a compression because that b value, or the value in front of the x, is bigger than 1. If you want to put this together, kind of all in one big thing, you can think about it this way. You can have A times f of bx minus c plus d. The A actually determines whether there's a reflection on the x-axis, okay, based on whether it is positive or negative. The reflection occurs when it's negative. And it also, the A also tells you whether there's going to be a vertical stretch or a compression. And again, it kind of logically makes sense. If that A is greater than 1, it's a stretch. Think about if we stretched you, you would get taller or skinnier. And if A is less than 1 but greater than 0, it's a compression. The B, let me change colors here. B, I'm going to scroll down a little bit too. The B tells you whether there's going to be a reflection on the y-axis. And again, that's determined by whether it's positive or negative. Negative causes a reflection. And it also tells you whether there's a horizontal stretch or compression. And again, the horizontal, it seems a little backwards if you think about it. But if A is greater than 1, it is actually a compression. And if it's between 0 and 1, it's a stretch. Then you have C, which is inside the parentheses with the X, and that represents your horizontal shift. And then finally, you have the D, and the D represents your vertical shift. So if you kind of get familiar with the location and what each one of those values do, depending upon where it's placed, that may help you to recognize what transformations are taking place. I can tell you that on test 3, you'll also be asked to do it looking at a graph, which I know you've looked at some of those on your quiz and your interactive practices.